Now, we've talked about some of the issues around abortion and legislation with abortion in South Africa. What about contraceptive? What are some of the issues around contraceptives in South Africa? It seems like they're widely available, but yet it seems that a lot of women are having children that they aren't able to care for.
My sense is that we do have reproductive services that's available. The big problem is that we don't have teenage-friendly services.
Okay.
So it's incredibly difficult for young girls to go into a service, although they're sexually active, to access contraception, although they're meant to be able to get it. So it's how services are structured,
Right.
and whether services are friendly and accessible enough for one to make use of it. So if you go once and it's just so a difficult experience, you're not going to go back a second time.
Right.
So it's about how our services are designed in order for one to feel free to use it. So I think a lot of what we've got to, so it's not about necessarily investing more in those services, but how do you skill your staff working in those services to understand how they should be reacting and interacting with young women coming into the service. The other problem around it also, I would say, is that, and it's not just young women who are, not wanting babies and dumping babies. It's older women as well who have had their families. And it's, if we start looking at, and this we clearly see with our HIV epidemic, is that women who are in violent relationships are at increased risk of developing HIV because they don't have control over contraception.
Right.
So what happens is that if you're in a relationship and there's gender-based violence and your partner don't want you to be using a condom or contraception, you have no control over that. So that in itself also talks to women's ability to control whether they have a baby or not. So that also leads to increased unwanted babies, and what then happens is that, she might have been in a violent relationship, and if we look at how big the magnitude of intimate partner violence is in South Africa, you can just imagine how big the problem is of women not having control over their own sexuality in terms of taking care of their reproductive needs.
So there really does need to be a shift, a huge shift
in many different ways.
A lot of different things.
So it's not just about reproductive services, it's about relationships as well, and gendered relationships and women's control over their own reproductive health within that context of male and female relationships.
Now, in your opinion, how do we move away from this?
I think it should be a two-pronged approach. My sense is that in terms of reproductive health services, there's a clear need for our policymakers and decision makers to look at how we strengthen provision of services. But on the other hand, there's a bigger need to start shifting dynamics around gender, women's place in society, and how we relate, because that also talks about children and young women's place in society, and how South Africa is a country with very high levels of sexual violence, and that all interacts. So it's not just one issue. You have to look at it as a total basket of issues that you have to work with. So my sense is, as a society, we've got to start looking at social norms as well, and start tackling very hard issues around what women's place is in society, how women and men relate. And it has to happen when you're in school. As young men and women, you've got to start looking at how you interact and how you relate, because that's when relationships are formed, and that's where the start of women, if you look at South Africa and sexual relationships, young women would say their first sexual relationship was coercive, and it wasn't where they really wanted to be in a sexual relationship. So if that's the norm, you've got to start asking yourself, how does that transcend their relationships just over generations,